Battle of the Trench, the untold Battle of the Trench. How did a single ditch defy the greatest coalition Arabia had ever seen? Why did a Jewish tribe inside Medina betray the Prophet at the worst possible moment? What secret strategy did one undercover Muslim use to shatter the enemy alliance from within? This isn't just a story of swords and sand. It's a masterclass in psychological warfare, divine timing, and the unbreakable spirit of a besieged people. From whispered conspiracies to a storm that tore tents from the earth, the Battle of the Trench is a tale of faith under fire and victory carved from desperation. So if you think you know how battles are won, think again, because this one rewrote the rules. After the Battle of Uhud, the Quraysh were strutting around Mecca like they just won the Arabian version of the World Cup. They believed they had avenged their loss at Badr and finally silenced Muhammad, peace be upon him. Spoiler alert, they hadn't. The Muslims, though bruised, were far from broken. In fact, they were quietly rebuilding, regrouping, and, most importantly, learning. Not long after, the Jews of Bani Nadir, who lived in Medina under treaty, decided to spice things up with a bit of treachery. They invited the Prophet to a meeting under the guise of diplomacy. But behind the scenes, one of them climbed a wall with a rock, ready to drop it on the Prophet's head. But Allah had other plans. Divine revelation came to Muhammad, peace be upon him, mid-meeting, warning him of the plot. He stood up and left immediately, leaving the would-be assassin holding a rock in a very awkward silence. That was it. The Prophet had shown patience, honored treaties, and tolerated provocations. But this was a red line. He ordered a siege of Bani Nadir's stronghold. The Muslims surrounded their fortress, cutting off supplies and waiting. The Jews, realizing they couldn't hold out, surrendered. They were exiled from Medina. But not all Jewish tribes were expelled. Those who honored their treaties were allowed to stay. The Bani Nadir, however, packed their bags. Some went to Damascus, but many settled in the fortress of Khaybar, nursing a grudge hotter than the desert sun. In Khaybar, the exiled Jews weren't just sulking, they were scheming. They gathered allies, plotted revenge, and sent a delegation of 10 to 15 men to Mecca. Their pitch? Let's finish what you started at Uhud. The Quraysh didn't need convincing. They were itching for another shot at Muhammad. Together they formed an alliance, the idolaters of Mecca and the Jews of Khaybar, united by hatred and ambition. The Quraysh sent envoys across Arabia, rallying tribes like Banu Ghatafan, Banu Murrah, and Banu Sulaim. The Jews did the same among their own. The result? A Confederate army of over 10,000 soldiers, a coalition of idolaters, mercenaries, and tribal warriors, marching toward Medina. Muhammad, peace be upon him, called a council. The Muslims were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. A frontal battle would be suicide. Then Salman the Persian, a brilliant tactician, suggested something radical: dig a trench. Arab warfare didn't do trenches. It was all about cavalry charges and open combat. But Medina had a vulnerability. It was exposed only from the north. The other sides were protected by mountains and dense buildings, like a natural fortress. So the Prophet marked the trench line himself, saying from here to there, assigning each group their section. And then he picked up a shovel. The Muslims dug day and night. The Prophet worked alongside them, covered in dust, lifting rocks and encouraging his companions. Those with beautiful voices recited poetry to lift spirits. The Prophet even joined in, repeating verses and smiling through the toil. It wasn't just a trench. It was a symbol of unity, resilience, and divine trust. Now pause for a sec. Step into the extraordinary. Subscribe to Eccentric Digital Pixel. Welcome to the wild frontier of creativity, where pixels pulse with imagination and every frame tells a story you've never seen before. At Eccentric Digital Pixel, we don't follow trends. We bend reality. From surreal digital art to mind-blowing visual experiments, this is your backstage pass to the future of expression. Why hit subscribe? Get exclusive access to jaw-dropping digital creations. Be the first to witness new drops by turning on notifications. Dive into a world of eccentric brilliance that inspires, challenges, and captivates. Join a community of visionaries who crave the unconventional. Don't just scroll, experience the pixel revolution. Smash that subscribe button and ring the bell to never miss a masterpiece, because normal is boring and you were born to see the world differently. The trench had been dug. The strategy was in place. and behind it stood the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, not in a palace or tower, but shoulder to shoulder with his 3,000 mujahideen, the warriors of faith. They were dusty, hungry, and outnumbered, but they were united. Meanwhile, the women, children, and elderly were secured in Medina's fortified compounds and castles, protected by stone walls and guarded gates. The city had become a fortress, every alley a potential battleground, every rooftop a lookout. But the real danger wasn't just in front, it was behind. The Banu Qurayza, a Jewish tribe living in Medina under treaty, had watched the siege unfold. And then, in a moment of treachery, they broke their pact with the Prophet. They sent a message to Abu Sufyan, the commander of the Quraysh. Be patient. We will attack the Muslims from behind. We will destroy them. It was a betrayal so deep it could have shattered morale. But the Prophet ﷺ, ever anchored in divine trust, simply said, Hasbunallah ni'mal wakil. Allah is enough for us. He is the best guardian. The plan was chilling. While the Muslim men were at the trench, the Banu Qurayza would raid the city, capture the women and children, and open the gates to the enemy. It was a nightmare scenario, but the Prophet ﷺ acted swiftly. He dispatched 500 companions to patrol the streets of Medina. These warriors didn't sneak around. They marched with loud takbirs, letting every rooftop and alley know Medina is guarded. Days passed. The siege dragged on. The betrayal loomed. But each morning, when the sun rose and no raid had come, the believers exhaled. Abu Bakr R.A. later said, "The fear we felt from Banu Qurayza about our children in Medina was greater than the fear we felt from the armies of Quraysh and Ghatafan." He would climb Mount Sela, gaze upon the peaceful homes of Medina, and whisper thanks to Allah for every untouched door, every safe child. Meanwhile, the trench was no quiet moat, it was a battleground. The polytheists launched frequent raids, probing for weaknesses, trying to breach the line. The fighting was fierce, often lasting late into the night. And where was the Prophet ﷺ? Not in the rear. He was personally guarding the narrowest part of the trench, the most vulnerable point. Sword in hand, eyes sharp, heart steady. The siege dragged on, supplies dwindled, morale cracked. The believers were tested, not just physically but spiritually. Allah describes it in Surah Al-Ahzab. When they came upon you from above and below, when eyes grew dull and hearts leapt to throats. Some began to doubt. The hypocrites whispered, Allah and His Messenger promised us victory only to deceive us. Others tried to flee, claiming their homes were exposed. But Allah knew they weren't afraid of exposure. They were afraid of commitment. If they were asked to cause sedition, they would do so immediately. But the true believers? They saw the Confederate army and said, "This is what Allah and His Messenger promised us," and it only increased us in faith and submission. The trench had held, the believers had endured, but the siege was far from over. The Confederate army still loomed, 10,000 strong, bristling with spears and vengeance. The Muslims were exhausted, hungry, and surrounded. And then, in the shadows of uncertainty, a single man changed the course of history. Nu'aym ibn Masud a respected figure among the Ghatafan tribe, had secretly embraced Islam. But he kept his conversion hidden, like a dagger beneath a cloak. He approached the Prophet ﷺ and said, "Command me, I will do whatever you ask." The Prophet, ever wise, replied, "You are only one man. Go and sow discord among our enemies." And so Nu'aym became a one-man psychological operation. Nu'aym first went to Banu Qurayza, the Jewish tribe that had betrayed Medina. He whispered, "Don't trust the Quraysh. They'll abandon you. Demand hostages before you act." Then he went to the Quraysh and said, "Banu Qurayza are hesitating. They might turn on you. Be careful." He repeated this with the Ghatafan and other tribes. Suspicion spread like wildfire. The once united Confederates began to fracture. Trust dissolved. Plans unraveled. The Jews of Banu Qurayza, now paranoid and isolated, withdrew from the siege, falling for Nu'aym's masterful deception. The Confederate army was now just a patchwork of nervous idolaters, each tribe doubting the other. But the Muslims were still cornered. The trench was holding, but barely. The siege dragged on. Morale was low. Hunger gnawed at their strength. And then came the verse that pierced through the gloom. "Do you think you will enter paradise without facing what those before you faced?" They were afflicted and shaken until even the messenger and the believers cried, "When will Allah's help come? Verily, Allah's help is near." Surah Baqarah 2. In the darkest hour, the prophet raised his hands and prayed, "O my Lord, the one who sent down the Quran, the one who holds the enemies accountable, scatter these tribes, break their unity, weaken their resolve." And then, his face lit up with a smile. Divine help had arrived. A violent storm swept across the valley of Medina. It was no ordinary wind, it was a divine whirlwind. Dust and sand filled the air, blinding the enemy. Tents were ripped from the ground, fires were extinguished. Camels and horses panicked, scattering in every direction. The Confederate army fell into chaos and misery. They fled, stumbling through the storm, abandoning their weapons, their pride, and their plans. Allah revealed, "O you who believe, remember Allah's favor upon you when armies came against you. We sent against them a wind and forces you did not see." Surah Al-Ahzab 33:9. The siege was over, the trench had held, the believers had endured, and Allah had delivered victory. The fleeing polytheists left behind spoils of war, food, supplies, weapons. The famine in Medina was lifted. The city rejoiced, and the Prophet ﷺ declared, "Now the guard is yours. From now on, the Quraysh cannot come upon you." No longer would the Muslims fight defensively. The tide had turned. The pride and power of the Quraysh were shattered. From now on, we will march on them. Next up, the Ridda Wars, when the Muslims took the offensive and reshaped Arabia. If you're captivated by these epic tales of strategy, faith, and divine intervention, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss another chapter of history brought to life.